Welcome to the latest episode of COP Conversations. As COP30 in Belém is already being framed as the implementation COP, the pressure is on negotiators to move beyond promises into tangible action. But the agenda is much wider. Adaptation, loss and damage, climate finance, and just transition are all converging as critical battlegrounds. To help unpack what's at stake, we are joined by Dr. Indu K Murthy, Sector Head for Climate, Environment and Sustainability at the Center for Study of Science, Technology and Policy, who has been closely following how adaptation and finance debates are evolving at the global stage. Welcome to the podcast, Dr. Murthy.
Hello, Anushka.
I just like to start, I just like to get into it right at the beginning. What's the one outcome that you'd like to see at COP30 in Belém? It is being framed as the implementation COP. So, what are your expectations?
Well, I would really hope that Belém is a critical inflection point because there's been several decades of negotiation and target setting that's happened. So, more than in its name, I would really like to see a significant outcome, which is credible operational architecture for climate, for scaling finance and technology transfer, particularly for adaptation and resilience in the context of the global south. If we are looking at it from an Indian perspective, I see the urgency as a twofold thing. A Adaptation must be placed on an equal footing with mitigation, which India has been fighting for very long, with measurable targets, predictable finance, of course, and agreed metrics for tracking progress. The second would be, implementation pathways that are tailored to national contexts, which is extremely important because it enables countries like India and the others in the global south to pursue low carbon growth without compromising on development imperatives. So that's how I would want Belém to kind of come up with. And over and above that, clarity on the new collective quantified goal on climate finance.
Right. So, you have given an all encompassing view. Let's just break it down a little bit more. Uh, Firstly, I want to talk about the COP30 has the Amazon rainforest as its backdrop. So, obviously, deforestation and indigenous rights will be in the spotlight. So, do you see a chance of real and actionable consensus at COP30 regarding those issues?
Well, precisely because of its location in Belém, which is at the heart of Amazon, um, I would really hope that the symbolism of the place actually kind of adds to the important issue that's at hand, because I don't think it's incidental. It highlights the global importance of tropical forests as carbon sinks and biodiversity hotspots, while it also kind of brings into sharp focus the communities that are actually kind of spearheading in the conservation itself. Now, that's one thing. The other is also about deforestation. Avoiding deforestation is a critical mitigation lever as well. And given that without halting deforestation, even the Paris goals are impossible to achieve. It is being increasingly accepted by both policymakers as well as financiers. So I guess it would kind of bring down to that point. Thirdly, the indigenous context that you did speak about in your opening remarks as well. These are territories which have demonstrably, lower deforestation rates, and of course, the land rights governance are also being increasingly recognized as well. So, given that both conservation and climate goals go hand in hand, COP30 could push this recognition into a more probably binding framework or a dedicated finance mechanism. And of course, last but not the least, there has been quite some momentum around this with some recent agreements, like the Glasgow Leaders Declaration that happened on forests and land use at COP26. Then you have the Kunming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework as well that happened in 2022, which sharply brings into central focus both the communities as well as the biodiversity angle. However, finance and implementation still continue to remain weak. Maybe COP30 does definitely offer a chance to concretize these commitments.
Right. So forests are, just one part of the bigger climate puzzle. There's adaptation and there's loss and damage, which are also equally urgent. So beyond mitigation, how do you see these discussions evolving at COP30? Because clearly we are not moving quickly enough to support vulnerable nations.
Hmm. True. So I think a key priority when you're looking at operationalizing the global goal on adaptation is definitely through measurable indicators and aligning the national adaptation plans more closely with the climate pledges that are happening. Uh, and we all know that finance has been the bottleneck. While COP29 did commit to a 300 billion annual target and a roadmap of about 1.3 trillion by 2035, delivery mechanisms have continued to remain unclear. Now, COP30 hopefully must turn this roadmap into a very practical, accessible finance that does not worsen debt burdens, of course, in the most vulnerable nations. And coming to the loss and damage fund, I think it is now operational, but it's severely underfunded. So COP30 hopefully will focus on looking at equitable as well as rapid disbursement mechanisms of the funds when they come in, and especially for fragile nations, while they are ensuring that affected communities, civil societies do have a stronger role in governance. When we talk about this, obviously the indigenous people's voices, health centered approaches kind of become very very centric to this entire argument about equity, culture, and people in adaptation. So progress is slow. There are funding gaps, cumbersome processes at the global level, lots of barriers, but yet we are hoping that the nudge towards a better clarity on these aspects do come in, and COP30 hopefully will match the political promises with real grant based and timely support.
Right. You did mention the global goal on adaptation. Now, this has been a big focus, especially since COP28.
Mm-mm.
You mentioned some of the sticking points, but I just wanted you to speak a bit more on those, and also how can countries like India influence the
Right.
outcome?
Yeah. So yes, I mean, like I mentioned, I think the GGA is, as it's popularly called, is stuck on key issues of lack of these measurable time-bound metrics and targets, weak commitments, of course, on the finance, and of course the means of implementation, as it's called, and the dilution of the fundamental equity principles in the
Right.
entire climate conversation and negotiations, which is common but differentiated
Yeah,
responsibilities,
yes,
right?
yes.
So, and then of course there is this fragmented governance angle that comes in, vague monitoring protocols and evaluation systems in place.
Right.
Now, developing countries like India are talking about this, and they will continue to and will need to push much harder, probably for stronger language on finance, technology transfer, and capacity building. Because unless we insist on equity as the central piece in the framework and build on robust national monitoring mechanisms, it cannot be an independent one. It will have to build on national mechanisms. So then there is a possibility that it will aid in strengthening domestic adaptation architecture as well. And then, of course, through broader funding mechanisms, integrate these into what are popularly called the NAPs, which is the National Adaptation Plans. As you're aware that India is preparing the National Adaptation Plan as we speak, and of course, NDCs and a whole bunch of things that are happening around us. So, aligning national priorities with GGA and also ensuring adaptation gains the prominence that it deserves in global climate governance is possible if countries like India push for it much more.
Right. You have spoken about India pushing for adaptation. The National Adaptation Plan is, I think, more of a focus than maybe the NDCs for India.
Mm-mm.
Um, I just wanted to know, beyond the finance lens, what can India and even the global South, how
Mm.
can they frame this issue so that it actually leads to results?
Right. So, to be very frank, I think, India has been consistently trying to kind of, bring this entire conversation around adaptation into the center of climate discussions over multiple COPs. And that's something the global south must continue to do. I don't think we should give up on that. But adaptation cannot be framed as a matter of finance alone. So I think
Mm.
we need to kind of change the narrative, and it has to be seen as a question of resilience building of development itself, or the developmental choices and the justice that goes alongside with it. So I think that's the narrative change which could potentially global south could adopt to push for it. And then beyond finance, there are also other pathways, for instance, knowledge and capacity building. Uh, Maybe India is in a fairly better place, but there are a lot of vulnerable countries who've had centuries of traditional and indigenous practices that are central to the way communities live, with variability, whether it is to do with water management, whether it is to do the way they do agriculture, or in the way they protect the coasts. Now, elevating this and integrating that knowledge with modern science can create scalable context specific solutions. So
Right.
that would be important too. And another pathway could be maybe through regional cooperation. That also is important because uh, let's remember that we do talk about climate and climate risk, but this, although we talk of it in a national context, when you think about climate risk itself as a physical phenomenon, it does not respect national borders, right?
Right.
We do share river basins. We have shared river basins. Monsoon systems are shared, the Asian monsoon patterns, and even migration pressures, they do demand that adaptation needs to be thought of as a transboundary collaboration ultimately. uh, Whether it is early warning systems, data sharing, or even joint investments in resilient infrastructure. And over and above this, of course, the policy and institutional architecture also becomes very, very important to think about, because uh, it's not a one off activity. When you talk about resilience building and adaptation, it will have to be mainstreamed into developmental planning, whether it is urban planning, whether it's agriculture, health, or disaster management. So this would obviously require governance systems which are participatory, agile, of course, and responsive to local needs. So, which is where I think so adaptation technically should become the voice and agency in some ways of pushing for the kind of things that countries like India have been asking for over the multiple COPs. And for the global south, it means pushing the narrative at the COPs that adaptation is about livelihoods, it's about dignity, and it's about sustainable futures ultimately.
Right. Which is obviously, it all comes under the umbrella of, justice and just transition. Um, but we usually talk about it in terms of energy and mitigation. But
Mm,
what about just adaptation?
right.
Making communities climate proof, livelihoods, homes. Is that conversation, gaining traction?
Um, Nationally, yes, definitely. But when you're looking at these, the COPs, I think we still need to push for it because, just adaptation, as you rightly kind of brought to the fore, it's about three things. First, you're protecting lives itself in some places through early warning systems, which would actually reach the last mile. The second is climate ready healthcare, which becomes really, really important. And of course, social safety nets become an integral part of that. The second should be about safeguarding the living spaces itself. We talk about resilient infrastructure. So, obviously, it does encompass resilient housing and all other supporting infrastructure that's needed for life to go on in a certain manner. And the other aspect, which is an extreme case, is when the living conditions in certain places could become completely unbearable, if I may use the word, where people will have to relocate. If it is unavoidable, this is the transition that we are talking about. Then I think, how do we ensure that it's done with dignity? There's some compensation that's involved, or there's consent that becomes an integral part. And then, of course, thirdly, I think securing the livelihoods, because for someone who's been farming for ages, doing something very different requires skilling, and maybe that's not something that they're very comfortable with. So, how do you help them to diversify? And this has to be a very systematic process, it cannot happen overnight. So, which means we are thinking about creating those opportunities much before then, when we are at a juncture when this kind of a a tipping point or a transition needs to kind of come in. So all the informal sector needs have to be considered. So I think countries like India do have a very key role to play, because these are lived realities in countries like India. We do experience, we
Right.
do see that we are kind of trying to see, how do we kind of not let them be, top down technocratic fixes ultimately, right?
Yeah.
So I think
Yeah.
we have to move away from that. Then globally, finance and solidarity, grants rather than loans become very, very important in those contexts. And
Sorry,
yeah,
sorry
so
to cut you off, because now I want to talk a bit about the money, because none of this works if there is no money, right? So
yes,
at
yes.
COP29, developed countries pledged $300 billion.
Mhm.
How do we make sure that it doesn't just remain a number? What reforms and mechanisms could guarantee, real transparency and accountability, and of course, at the implementation stage as well,
Right,
that this
right.
comes
No,
handy.
as you rightly point out, finance is actually the deal breaker ultimately. We've been talking about it for the longest time, but I think developing countries have always found a way to kind of walk back on it in some way or the other. And also, given the way climate has panned out, the kind of disasters that have been recorded, even in those, developed countries. So I personally think, the argument is kind of going to flip in this particular COP, and they say we ourselves are going through this. We have our own, expenditure that we need to incur. So how are we? But then I think here again, I would like to draw us back into the historical responsibilities that are there. They have
Yes.
led to where we are today. So I think it is going to be quite a significant roadblock, I would say. But hopefully the north-south tensions on the responsibility, the divide, the geopolitical divide that's kind of continue to remain, will probably will, or rather, I can't say probably dissolve. I would say I hope it dissolves over time.
Yeah.
Yes.
No, it's interesting that you've used the word roadblock, because you've been tracking these issues for a long time, and through the lens of science.
Mm.
You were a contributing author to the IPCC's fourth assessment report as well. We are seeing there, how a lack of consensus between developed and developing countries is delaying the seventh assessment report,
Right.
timeline. From your perspective, what does this deadlock tell us about the state of global cooperation on climate science,
Mm,
especially?
mm. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I think it's definitely evolved over time. If we look at the IPCC fourth assessment report, which I was part of, adaptation was still framed largely as a secondary track to mitigation, more like a stepsister kind of a thing. Although important, but not central to climate policy. That's where we were. Then
Yeah.
subsequently, the fifth and sixth assessment reports, it kind of evolved, and there's a lot of focus that's come in. Likewise, the other global reports, like even the global environmental outlook, which I've been part of as well, uh, it brought in a regional focus, because they brought in a series of regional reports as well. And I was part of the Asia Pacific report, where there were clearly those reports highlighted, and even in the GEO 7, which is under review right now. There again, these disproportionate risks to vulnerable communities, different regions, are all being highlighted very clearly using a system level approach. So I think the focus is definitely shifting in the way science is looking at adaptation itself. And it's so I would definitely argue that it's moved from the margins to slightly towards the center, but it's still yet to become mainstream. Of course, recognition is there, but that really does not solve the problem. Just recognizing the problem, you need to think about how to solve the problem. So which is
Right.
why while consistently all of these reports and arguments have been flagging the urgency of scaling finance or building institutional capacity itself, I think translation of this into practice has definitely been uneven. Now, for that to become a reality, then I think it's time to reflect on these lessons learned through these dedicated goals and finance discussions that have been happening over time. And hopefully, the persistent gap that remains kind of dissolves, and
Right.
there is some action in that particular direction.
But Dr. Murthy, have you seen, do you think that the findings of these scientific reports have they really shaped action at forums like COP?
I would say partly yes and partly no. Yeah. So, because I think one of the key issues around the way these reports are, it's about the timing, a whole lot of argument. If you remember, before the seventh assessment report, as you rightly said, it was about the time of delivery of these reports and how that could kind of help in looking at the NDC, delivery of NDC goals or the global goal on adaptation. So I think there's been a whole lot of going back and forth on this. While this is definitely kind of informed, but I mean, I wouldn't say that's the only thing that's kind of determined the way things have panned out. We all know that, geopolitical aspects have definitely kind of overridden science in the way things have panned out over the years. And I don't see why or how it can change so quickly that people just focus on the science part of it.
Yes, because the US's absence has really, I think, made a
Yes,
difference even at the IPCC, and I mean, we're expecting it at COP as well.
right.
So I agree with what you're saying.
Yes.
So I'll just ask my final question now. I wanted to zoom out a little bit.
Hmm.
You have said, that climate issues cannot be solved single-handedly, and we need an ecosystem of actors and solutions.
Hmm.
So, in that sense, do summits like COP30 still play a meaningful role, or are they just drifting away from ground realities?
I think each have their own value, if I may say so, because summits like COP30 do have some meaning, but with clear limitations, because they do remain at the global stage. It does bring together countries in some manner where major emitters, vulnerable nations alike do come together, and they do provide those high level frameworks, targets, political grants, and so on and so forth, which ultimately shape the national policies and international accountability ultimately. They also generate some level of momentum for non-state actors as well, because cities, businesses, civil societies also kind of congregate in these kind of corps where they forge alliances and then step up and amplify voices as well. So it kind of serves that purpose. But at the same time, as you rightly said, these summits do get bogged down in process, a whole lot of process heavy negotiations that do happen constantly. And then, of course, there are these language battles which continue to happen out there as well, which is very far removed from the urgency of implementation, especially in terms of uh, adaptation and finance support that's required in the context of the disconnect that remains from the local lived realities, whether it is to do with agriculture, water security, or an informal workers livelihood, day to day life that gets impacted by these vagaries of nature that we are talking about. So in that sense, uh, COP30 cannot be seen as an end in itself, but it's definitely an enabler. And I see its value on in its ability to kind of influence how effectively global frameworks get translated to local action, and also influences regional networks, community driven solutions, ultimately ends up in building resilience where it matters the most.
So, on that hopeful note, thank you for your time, Dr. Murthy. As Dr. Murthy reminds us, COP30 can sharpen the global adaptation agenda and restore credibility on climate finance, but only if governments close the gap between negotiation rooms and the realities of vulnerable communities. If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe to COP Conversations. We'll be bringing you more insights as we count down to COP30.